From the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this is NCITE Insights. I'm your host, Erin Grace. Join us as we discuss today's most pressing issues in terrorism and targeted violence with experts from the field. Welcome to NCITE Insights. We have a special guest today, all the way from Georgia, John Horgan.
Thrilled to be here. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Okay, welcome.
Love being back in Omaha. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, really glad to have you here. John, we have a whole list of things to talk about today, but first let's get to our mutual friend Sam's question of the day. So for our listeners / viewers, they don't know this, but every day there's a deep, provocative question on the whiteboard, and everybody gets to answer it. And the question, it had to do with, are people inherently good or not good? And I took my little line and I went right off the board because, you know, I'm Sissy Sunshine.
Just to be contrarian, I had a much shorter line than you, and I said, no, perhaps I'm just seeing too much of the bad right now, and so much of the bad in the last few years internationally. But I, through my research, for good or bad, have come to see how capable people are of engaging in the most horrific acts. Whether casual or otherwise to one another, and it's shaped my view. But my wife will say it's all just an act, and I'm fundamentally an optimist. I just don't like to show it. But yeah, I don't know.
Well,
it's hard to be an optimist these days, I think.
That's probably a good spot to get to question number one, which is lay the table for us. We are 1 month into the year 2025. What do you see happening in your crystal ball for this year?
I see uncertainty, I see anxiety, I see on an international scale, I see a lack of moral, ethical clarity. I see a lack of leadership. I see the rise of populism worldwide, and I see people crying out for good, sound, ethical, moral leadership to help solve the problems of the day, and that is regrettably in short supply.
It will, in the absence of leadership, can you relate that to terrorism? Are you expecting? To
an extent. I mean, I think terrorism is one of those things. I've always seen terrorism as a symptom of bigger problems.
Okay.
And terrorism tends to thrive in times of uncertainty and chaos. But it's always a sign of something bigger going on. We are still coming to grips with the extraordinary catastrophe that has befallen both Israelis and Palestinians, and trying to make sense of all of that. There is no doubt in my mind that the fallout from all of that is going to radicalize and mobilize the next generation of terrorists worldwide. But when it comes to predicting terrorist events, none of us would even try that. But I worry now, and to echo a point that's been made many times, that all of the red lights are blinking, and they're blinking nonstop right now.
I mean, if you think about how we began 2025, mere hours in, was a terrorist attack.
Yes. Yeah,
in a beloved, iconic American city, New Orleans.
Yeah.
And that wasn't somebody that maybe in hindsight it makes sense that guy did that thing, but
they all make sense in hindsight, and this is one of the traps we always fall into. We strive to try to make sense of it. We look for a motivation and ideology, something that helps us something that makes us feel a little bit more comfortable in the moment. I mean, one of the questions we wrestle with as terrorism researchers is wondering why we don't actually see even more terrorism. So I think we have been. It seems like an odd thing to say, and it sounds almost borderline offensive to say, but I think domestically here we have been relatively lucky thus far that we haven't seen more of these types of events.
When you ask that question, why haven't we seen more? Is that because our national security apparatus is just so good they've prevented it and you never hear about that? Or is it another explanation?
It's almost impossible to say. I mean, there is there's a lot, in fact, to be said about the successes that the national security apparatus has had. I don't know that we haven't necessarily heard about it. I mean, sometimes, and it might be that our memory of this recedes pretty quickly, or media coverage recedes pretty quickly, but there have been no shortage of high-profile examples of things that have been averted or foiled or failed. And this is why, researchers like here at NCITE don't just look at successful attacks, but they look at near misses. And there have been quite a few of those. But we have a public that I think is by and large sensitive to the ongoing threat of terrorism. It's something we need to be alert to, something we need to be aware of without walking around in a constant state of hypervigilance or fear. I think to an extent, people are more likely than not to at least be willing to report suspicious behavior. To whom is another question, and how they do it is another question. But I think we have been relatively lucky, particularly compared to many other countries facing terrorist threats right now.
When we talk about Sam Hunter's question, are people inherently good or bad? We were on opposite ends of that whiteboard, I guess. You've written a book, Terrorist Minds. You look at the psychology of terrorism, of violent extremism. So terrorists are they made, not born? Is that the idea? Is it
they're made? There's no question they're made. And one of the, I've been studying terrorism for almost 30 years now. It's been 25 years since I got my Ph.D. And one of the fascinating, one of the many, many things that continues to fascinate me about terrorism is not so much why do people do it, but why so few people do it? It's one of the fundamental questions we still grapple with. Given the big picture issues, the ideologies, the injustices that are out there, the winds of change that radicalize and push people into exploring and embracing different kinds of beliefs. Why don't more people engage in it? And that's the question that we wrestle with as researchers all the time. The vast majority, you've heard me say this before, and we've talked about this before, but the overwhelming majority of people who hold radical, even extremist views, will never cross over into engaging in or considering a terrorist act.
It's very comforting when you give me those numbers, but what's your hypothesis?
I think, I don't know that I have a clear hypothesis about it, but it's something that we just can't really explain very well. I think to go back to your earlier point about how, whenever an attack unfolds, we try to reverse engineer the sequence of it. We try to look at a person's history of radicalization. We try to figure out if there's an ideology present or absent, or maybe more than one ideology, as we see an awful lot these days. But we can't, there's no predictive logic in those answers. We can't re-reverse it then, if you like, and say, well, this is the sequence that explains how people get radicalized. The short answer is we don't know. We still, despite all of the incredible research that's been done over 30, 40 years now, and just in my field alone, the psychology of terrorism, we don't have answers that to the general public would be convincing in terms of explaining the difference between the person who holds radical views versus the person who crosses over and commits a terrorist act. That is not to say that the people we call terrorists don't have things in common. We can find some of those common denominators. I can happily talk to you about those, but they tend to be so broad as to be not especially convincing.
That's very interesting. I had a conversation recently with a physical therapist friend of mine who said one thing she's noticed that's different is that patients are coming in just commenting on, say, the political scene. So instead of just their injury, they want to engage in this subject in a way they hadn't before. And she had wondered if some of it was like this transference that happens. You have something that's kind of wrong or bugging you in your life that you are seizing this kind of external thing to.
Yeah. That can often be the seed of it. I mean, it takes an awful lot more than that because what you just described is normal, fairly typical, I would say, and it's something that we all experience on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week or month-to-month basis. From interviews that I and many others have done with people who have become involved in terrorism, they will often tell us something that starts with that type of kernel. It's about being open, being sensitive to some injustice that's going on in the world, something that they feel some connection to, whether personally, through family, or they just see it on the 6 o'clock news, quite frankly. And that sense of outrage develops around this injustice that has been committed. That is a very, very normal process, and many, if not most of us, would feel the same way. The difference in terms of the mindset of the terrorist is that this person wants to they don't just want to do something about it, so they're fed up just talking about it, thinking about it. They want to do something about it. And either on their own or with the help of others or fueled through an ideology, they come to believe that violence is the only acceptable solution to fixing that injustice or righting that wrong.
So what have you learned in your fieldwork talking to people? Let me ask this better. Sorry. How has it gone talking to people versus theoretically just studying examples of, how terrorist events have happened?
Sure. Well, I'm a scientist, so, theory is important and all of that. It's important to have a sense of the big questions that guide us into what we should be looking at and how we should be looking into it. To me, though, there is absolutely no substitute to doing what you and I are doing right now. We're sitting here having a normal conversation. The interviews that I've done with people who've been involved in terrorism they're just like this. We're having a conversation. Now, it's more than that, and this is something that I would work through with my students back at Georgia State. We're doing semi-structured interviews where we're gently guiding our conversation onto psychologically based notions. If the person is giving responses in terms of propaganda, I'm acknowledging that, but I'm also trying to get a sense of who you are as a person. For the most part, when I speak to people who've been involved in terrorism and I ask them, how and why they get involved, the why is kind of unanswerable, and I'm not just saying that because I'm an academic, I swear. But whenever I ask that question, I typically get an answer that's framed in terms of propaganda. It's framed in terms of the person will say, well, this is why we are doing what we're doing and we're trying to fix this injustice. And all of that might be completely accurate and rational and meaningful for that person. They're not necessarily lying.
Right, they're
sincere. Just doesn't they're sincere for sure. It just doesn't tell me anything about, but why you? Out of all of the people who see this going on, you decided you wanted to actually do something about it. So tell me more about that. So I like to get into people's stories, their histories, and where they grew up and what kinds of experiences they had, to try to gently and as carefully as I can rebuild that sequence so that we can try to identify, ideally, common patterns. If we can interview enough people and we can see that there are similarities either across groups or ideologies or whatever it might be. But I've found, by and large, people will talk. They tend to be cooperative. Everyone likes to have a conversation, like to tell their own story. And in the right circumstances, we as academics can do this ethically, we can do it rigorously, and we can do it ideally with as many people as we can get access to. It's easier said than done.
Of course. Well, tell us about the types of places where you've conducted these interviews.
Let's see. Well, I started off in Ireland, England, Scotland, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, where else? Indonesia, all over North America, of course.
Have you done it in the United States?
Yes, yeah.
And in each time, was the setting like a prison?
No, wildly differs. So sometimes it's a prison, sometimes it's a so-called deradicalization facility, which might be connected to a prison, but people are transitioning out and they're going through a program. In some countries, so Somalia, for example, was a very quick and dramatic lesson in just meeting people who had gotten out of their movement, and we just met them in a hotel. With ideally, an academic will meet with someone who is a former terrorist. They're no longer involved. Typically, they'll have served some custodial sentence, and we can meet them in a public place, in a coffee shop, and have a normal conversation. So the settings wildly vary.
And did you notice among the people that you interviewed a portion of which were remorseful?
It varied. It varied. Some were, some weren't. Most of them, I would say, were what I would call disengaged, which means that they're no longer involved in the movement. They're no longer involved in doing things that benefit the movement, but they still hold on to the ideas, the commitment. They're still as dedicated as ever to the goals, for sure. Yeah, and some they're disengaged in what I would call deradicalized. So they're out. They're away from the movement, and they've also turned their back, or rather turned their minds away from the movement.
What has to happen for a psychology to change, especially one that is so deeply held you would commit an act of violence for it? So what factors, protective factors, I guess we'd call them, need to occur just in general for kind of that mindset shift, even if the first step is just disengagement? So they may still hold the beliefs, but they're not going to act on them.
Yeah. Well, there's been a big debate for years in the academic community about, whether disengagement ought to be the, quote, goal of interventions or de-radicalization. And I've taken a strange amount of flack from suggesting to fellow academics that disengagement ought to be the priority. Mm-hmm. I don't think typically we do a very good job of changing people's beliefs. And by and large, people are not going to change their beliefs if you tell them, I want you to change your beliefs. And I've seen so many interventions by state actors and others to try to make that happen. Mm-hmm. That's been engineered through de-radicalization programs, and they, the vast majority of them fall very, very flat in their face. But there's an awful lot we can do to try to get people to physically shift what they are doing, to pull people out of these movements. Terrorist organizations and terrorist movements today are full of people who are disillusioned. They just don't necessarily see an exit path for them. And particularly today, when I think the very meaning of what it means to be involved in terrorism is shifting, and the ground is shifting underneath us. We don't just have traditional organizations and movements; they still exist. But we have people demonstrating commitment online to groups that are thousands of miles away. They're deeply embracing of an online platform and community, and that's what's radicalizing them. But what we try to do is to figure out, well, what makes practical sense in the now as a first step to reducing the risk that this person might pose, either to themselves or to others. And disengagement is the most important principle there.
Absolutely, that makes such logical sense to me, and I can understand that there would be natural resistance to being told, think something different.
It seems to be. It just seems to be a very idealistic and unfortunately rather naive view that we can just, change one ideology with another, and that somehow changes the level of risk associated with whether or not a person is going to commit an act of violence or not. So it's so much more than that. But the ways in which we talk about this, the ways in which we talk about trying to bring around this change is fairly naive. And for good or for bad, the vast majority of people who become involved in terrorism, they change on their own anyway. Some become more committed, many become less committed, and then they just, they become disillusioned, or they just get burned out, or they want to try something else or something different. But people tend to change on their own eventually.
But in that regard, what could individuals or societies do to promote disengagement? I mean, what have you found to be the most influential arguments for disengaging, or does that process have to happen uniquely to the individual?
Yes and no. So there are things we can do. We can, for example, call greater attention to the negative implications of being in these groups. We can we can do an awful lot through media and other sources to de-glamorize and demythologize the sort of the ideal view that people have about what being involved is actually like. I've seen that gain some great traction in terms of dissuading potential foreign fighters or foreign travelers going abroad to join groups that will, at an absolute minimum, disabuse them of any dreams of glory that they're about to enter into. However, It is still largely a very personal journey, and someone isn't going to necessarily be receptive to that message. You know, if we say, let's say we have public service announcements, or we have some sort of media campaign to highlight what the reality of terrorists' lives are like. It's a lot uglier and a lot harder and a lot more work than someone might fantasize about at the point of radicalization and recruitment. To some who aren't necessarily that ideological to begin with, that might be enough to get them to think, you know what, maybe this isn't for me. I still feel very strongly about this, but maybe I need to get involved in the struggle in some other way. We can highlight the role of recruiters. We can warn about recruitment strategies. We can tell people about how they might be manipulated or exploited into serving other people's agendas. We can do all of that. However, to a different mindset, it's those very hardships that constitute the challenge. There's been no shortage of would-be terrorists who they've done their homework, they've done their research on these groups, they know it's hard, they know about the sacrifices they're going to make, and for them, that is the allure.
Of course
the view
it is.
As well. You know, not everybody would do this, therefore I need to be the one to rise up and meet the challenge.
So what hope do you have, knowing that the lights are blinking, the table that you laid for us seems bleak, John, when you say it. I don't want you to artificially give a hope just to have one, but where do you personally in this line of work find some reason to keep doing
Why
it?
do you think I have any hope about this?
Well, you're still, I mean, if you were hopeless, then you're on an island having a margarita, right? You know,
Sure.
Yourself.
If only. No, I'm not hopeless about this. I've seen, so I'm very passionate about terrorism research, and I have seen such incredible progress over the last few decades, and especially being here this week and meeting students at NCITE. The future is bright for terrorism research. I see the next generation of researchers who have access to so much more than we had when we were up and coming researchers trying to make sense of all of this. Ironically, I see some of the brightest and most practical interventions coming in this space when we don't restrict our focus onto actually terrorist actors. It took me a long time to sort of get that shift in focus, but when we started to consider what goes on around the terrorist, what kinds of things he, she, or they are leaking to friends, family, coworkers about the things that they do, the things that they care about. There is, I'm pretty sure we've chatted about this in the past, but this bystander effect. The people that surround the terrorist are often the first to know that something is not quite right. And I'm not just talking about being aware of somebody's grievance in general, but actual plot details, that they're going to go right down to this location on a Friday and do this one thing. So we know that this information, for reasons we don't understand, we know that this stuff is very often it is being leaked. There have been some tremendously exciting interventions supported through funding from the Department of Homeland Security and others to try to figure out what we can do to better encourage intimate bystanders to report those concerns. And that for me is where I see, that's where I see the hope. I do see that we can make a practical difference in terms of, it might seem like very, very small comfort. We're talking about something very, very late in the process. I don't think fundamentally as a society we are well built or well equipped to prevent terrorism right now.
If you were king of the world, what would you prescribe or change or want to see?
Where do we start? I couldn't even begin to answer that question. I don't think even the king of the world could undo the injustice and horrific scale of what we are capable of doing to one another. I mean, these, for good or for bad, these are the things that radicalize the young people of today. They're not necessarily engaging in obscure ideological tracks that they're finding on 4chan or 8chan as they would have back in the day. They're turning on the 6 o'clock news. They're looking at people that look like them, and they're wondering, why do these people have to suffer so much, and why is nobody doing about it? No, why is nobody doing anything about it?
Right, right. Okay, well, when you are king of the world, I'll come back to you for a better answer to that question. I want to talk to you, I want to shift gears a little bit. There are probably really good metaphors in your next passion. Is mountain climbing the right way to say it?
Yeah, mountain climbing.
Okay,
yeah,
tell us
yeah,
about
yeah.
that and where you just were. And
Yeah, I've just come back from Argentina. I had a very terrific time on Aconcagua, which is the highest peak in Argentina and highest peak in the Western Hemisphere. So outside of the Himalayas, it's the highest point in the world. And yeah, I had a ball. Yeah, it was 2 weeks of suffering and freezing and being barely able to breathe at just under 23,000 feet, but it was awesome. Yeah, yeah.
is that the tallest peak you've climbed so far?
It is, yes. Yeah,
So
yeah,
did you
yeah.
think at a certain point that in those 2 weeks, like,
No, I didn't. I that's not to say I haven't had that feeling on many other mountains, but no, Aconcagua was. I had a bit of a mental block around it for a while because it has a reputation as being a hard mountain, and it is a hard mountain. But I was very fortunate to have a tremendous guide who has a lot of experience on the mountain, and he just showed me the way, and I followed him up there, and it was terrific. Yeah, it's my passion. It's whenever I want an escape from my other passion, which is terrorism research, I like to just get up into the mountains and clear my head. It's type 2 fun. It's never fun while you're doing it, but to talk about it now, I talk your ear off about mountaineering.
well,
so,
okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
here's what I want to know. Is it the journey, the destination, or both? Like, is it the minute you summit that you feel like, how did you feel when you reached the peak of
Just relief. I'm like, thank God, we're done. It's funny. So different climbers will give you different answers on that. But for me, it is the journey. There's no doubt about it. And it's it's the cliche. It's the friendships you make along the way and all the rest of it. And some mountains, I'm 40. My wife's a mountain climber, so we get to climb a lot of stuff together. And we've got a group of friends and different combinations of us will climb different mountains. And for me, getting to the top is nice, that's sure. But for me, it's really is about just sort of, it sounds so cliche, bear with me, but it's challenging yourself. It's about just the physical grind of just put one step in front of the other and just try to push through. Try to go one more hour. And it's liberating, when you have the freedom to be able to do that, and in an environment that is just so stunningly beautiful. I can't even explain it. I get very emotional on mountains, and because they're my happy place. But for me, it's not about the summit per se, although the summit is nice. The most alive I feel is just below the summit, where I can look at it and I can see it. And mountains are very deceptive because you can see a summit and it can still be 10 hours away. But when I'm about 30 to 40 minutes away from summiting, and I know there's nothing is going to stop me from getting up there, that's my special moment. Yeah.
So the end is in sight, but you're not quite there yet. Anticipation.
Yeah. And I always take a moment to, if I can, and if it's safe, I'll stop and just take in the moment and know, all right, I'm good. I can turn back now and I can safely say I had an amazing time. But hey, we have a weather window. Storm is moving in. Let's get up there. Let's tag the top and let's get the hell out of here.
So what date did you hit?
I think it was the 18th of December at about 2 p.m. local time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
we had a 1-day window we needed to get up there, and that's the benefit of having local expertise. So.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
I'm afraid that it's time because I want to talk to you about the other peaks and what's next. So we'll just have to have you back on.
Sure.
Thank you, John Horgan.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
This series is produced by Ben Badafarano, Erin Grace, Scott Jordan, and Blake Ersch. Thank you for joining us for another episode of NCITE Insights. The National Counterterrorism, Innovation, Technology, and Education Center, or NCITE, is an academic center of excellence for the Department of Homeland Security. Looking to find out more? Check out our website at ncite.unomaha.edu or email us at ncite@unomaha.edu. ncite.edu.